I'm Dick King. We're going to give you a basic fundamental class on hand and power scraping. But before I give you any real hands-on training, I'm going to give you some charts or show you some charts that we've prepared. When we're working with scraping, we work with points per square inch. The majority of the machine tools that are in this country, we scrape to approximately 20 points per square inch, between 40 and 60% contact. If we're going to be working on jig bores or real precision grinders and machine tools, we try to scrape to 40 points at 40 to 60%. A lot of the machine tools in the industry have had the reputation of being a disposable machine tool because they wear out real fast. Well, what happens is the machine tools are scraped to these types of accuracies. But what we're going to try to achieve by hand today is to 20 points and with about 40 to 60%. And later on, I'll review with the power scraper, and we'll get to that point too. Scraping is fairly basic. When we're trying to scrape the per square inch parts, and we count how many points there are per square inch, basically what we think about is like a table weigh running against a saddle. If we had that machine sitting on, we had a 1,000-pound table sitting on 2 points, high spots, we'd have 500 pounds per point. Now, it's really easy to understand that if you had that much weight on those 2 points would wear out very fast. So if we had that same 1,000 pounds sitting on 10 points, we'd have 100 pounds per point. And if we had it sitting on 20 points, it's 50 pounds per point. Real basic. Now, there's been a misconception in the scraping business for years where a lot of people assumed they had to have 80% contact, like this. Well, in the machine tools, we want to get 50% contact because we have to have as many high spots as we do low spots. The low spots are for the oil. The high spots are the weight carrying factors. This basically what we're going to try to achieve today. Our scrapes, when we scrape, are going to be approximately 5/10 to 1,000 deep. And we're going to get as many low spots as we are high spots. Now we have a real good bearing here, but their depth is off. It's only 50 millionths deep. Well, what happens there, the machine runs real well, and all of a sudden it wears out, and there's no place for the oil to go, and the machine starts to score gall. Now this particular one would be that big contact area. You have some good depth, but there's too much contact area. The machine will start to gall up right away. And a lot of times people think dirt gets into machine tools and that's what causes the scores or the galls. Actually, in reality, it's the lack of lubrication. Now this is what I talked about earlier about the disposable machine tools. You can imagine if you had all this area of weigh with only these few contact points. It won't take very long and that machine will be wore out, completely out of tolerance. Now I'm using a hand scraper. It's a 380 BL diaper scraper, and I've loaded it with a 150 series blade. Now I believe, and I was taught, to push the scraper with your body. Now there are people that will scrape by hand with their arms, but it's just common sense. They'll tell you can push this a lot longer this way. Another thing that I try to do when I scrape, I try to scrape diagonal lines across my part. We go diagonal lines across the part, and next time I'll come back and I'll scrape diagonal lines across the part this way. And what that does, it achieves what I call the checkerboard effect. And when you're getting the checkerboard effect, it draws the bearing out real fast. You'll see a lot of people when they scrape, they'll be standing here and around here. They never do get a good pattern. But with my technique, we go diagonally across our part. And I'm not a big believer in people going long strokes. Because what will happen, a lot of times a person will accidentally turn the blade and he'll scratch the part. And that's a terrible thing. You never want to scratch your parts in hand scraping or power scraping. So what I'm going to do here now is rough scrape this. and then I'll glue it up. I have this yellow highlighter on here. It's a product that DEPRA sells, and it basically takes away the glare and it'll let you know where you're going. Years ago we used to use red lead. Well, this is a red lead substitute, and it's approved by OSHA, which is real important nowadays. See how I push down on the scraper and it bends the blade. We're trying to get some material off. A lot of guys go like this. We call that chicken scratching. You don't get anything off. You want to get in there and get it off fast so you don't have to work so long. Come back and get what I just missed. Okay. Now we'll wipe this off. And what I generally use to dilute the ink is just some standard household glass cleaner. There's many brands out there that you can use. Just put this on a real thin layer. Wipe it off, just takes away the glare. Now we'll come in again. Now when I was taught as a young boy to scrape from my father, he taught me to scrape and come out, scrape and come out. And you don't leave a burr. Now, over in Switzerland and a lot of the European countries, they'll hook scrape. And they'll take their scrapers and they'll pull it and hook scrape. And like in Japan now, they scrape and they come out. But I know a lot of machine tool builders here in the United States, and I've tried both directions. A lot of times I just slide it back and I leave a little burr at the end of my scrape mark. I have to be a little more careful when I'm done scraping to remove the burr, not the scrape mark. But for me, it goes faster, especially when you're roughing. I tell people that there's a lot of people that scrape in this world, and I've seen them, just a majority of them scrape from, like, say, Europe, Eastern, Western United States, Japan, and I always tell people, I really don't care how you scrape, as long as you can get the same amount of work done in the same amount of time. That's what's important, and get the same quality of work. A lot of people argue that their way is the best. I always say there's always a better method. Now, I was real lucky and fortunate as a young man. I was taught by a professional who wanted me to learn the best. And we were always trying to get better productivity so we could make more money in our business. So I was real lucky compared to somebody that might have bought, a book and started to read a book and had no basic fundamentals to follow. And he might have been fighting this for a long time. Now, our techniques are proven. I've been teaching classes now for approximately 10 years, and I've had real good results with the classes. Okay, now there's two different ways that we can deburr the part now, or there's a few different ways. We can either file it, but a file you can get too much material off. And when we file, all we want to do is take off this little burr that's left here. File will take off the high spots. Our gauge that we have with DEPRA, it's got a little deburring edge. They use this a lot over in Europe. This basically just deburrs the part, or a lot of people like to use a stone. I tell people to make sure, I usually recommend a medium Indian stone. And just go across here and feel it. Now, I use the highlighter later on when I'm getting more points per inch. But right now we're just going to go over on the surface plate and blue this up. Now, The bluing technique that I use, we use a water-soluble ink. It's nice because you don't have to get the other styles of inks, you can't wash it out of your hands. This I can wash it, go to the sink and wash it. It'll wash right out with soap and water. Now see what I did here? I put the ink on this and rolled it out, similar to the way you would use a paint roller in a paint pan. You keep this wet. Come over here to your table. Always wipe your table off with your hand. That's what's nice about this ink. You can feel the dirt. A lot of people will take a rag. Well, there's lint on that rag and you can't feel the dirt. But if you come over here with your hand, roll the ink on, and another rule of thumb too about the ink, when you put the ink on, you put it on so that you can still see the plate underneath the ink. That's about the right thickness. Otherwise, you get it on too thick and you'll get smears. Okay, now I set the plate on. This is a real important principle, and also make sure you pay attention to this part. Now, we're going to rub it. And what we're going to do now, after we rub it, we're just not going to pick it up and go scrape it. We're going to leave it on here. We're going to rub it. Now, remember this. You rub it, and then you have to hinge this part to find out where the fulcrum point is, or the hinge point. When this is perfectly flat, it's going to hinge approximately 30% in from both ends. And what they call this, the engineering group, the rotation of points. Now, you can just imagine, let's say there was a real big high burr on this corner. I would just put a thousandths feeler gauge under here, and see how it pivots right here? Or if it was high in the center, it pivots in the middle. So, like I say, what we try to achieve is a kind of a happy medium of those two, and it's at 30%. So we hold it at approximately 30%. We don't push down on it or we'll bend the part. Another thing I like to see a person do is to measure with a feeler gauge as he goes along. We're real fortunate we had these Blanchard ground, but you might have a part that isn't, and you might be able to get 10 thousandths in one side or another. So you need to know. I don't like to see a guy just rub it, hinge it, and take it over without feeler gauging it. It might be off a mile, and he'll be scraping on it for a week, and it'll come and get better and get better and get better, but he's just wasting time and effort. So see where we're hinging? Down here, there's a high spot there, and down here it's fairly flat. It's pretty good. So now I'll go back and I'll scrape on it a few more times. And remember, you got to change directions. Each time you change directions. Now, like I said, this time I'll scrape from this direction. Next time I'll come from this direction so we get the checkerboard look. Now, earlier on, I have already scraped another part that I'll show you. Now, like I say, this has only been scraped twice. This was ground within a thousandths. We've already got a fairly decent bearing. Now this part, we scraped it for approximately half an hour, and I've got approximately 10 points on here. I could spend another half an hour and I get down to my 20 points. Now one thing you need to remember in this tape, I've always told my students, it's real easy to learn how to scrape something flat, but knowing where to scrape and how much to take off is a trade. Now, I don't want my students and the people that watch this tape to expect miracles right away, because you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. But scraping flatness and taking your time and learning how to check your alignments is very important. Another thing I want to show you right now then is how we used to hand flake. After we reached our 20 points per inch, we would half moon flake it is what we would call. This is an old style half moon flaker. Now remember, when you flake, you're going to lose approximately 50% of the contact area. So that's why it's important that you get at least 20 points. Now if you stopped at 10 points and flaked it, you only have 5 points left. So you have to get at least 20 points. And when you flake one side. And a lot of guys, and I know why, because it looks nice, flake the exposed surfaces. Now I tell people it's common sense. I'll tell you, if you have a part like, say this is the bottom of a base on a grinder, and your table traverses back and forth, and you have a flaked area down here that's exposed, it looks real pretty, but you get grinding grit and chips down on here, and then it'll just carry the dirt underneath the table, and it'll start to gall and score the machine. What I always believe in is that you flake the unexposed surface. It isn't as pretty, but common sense will tell you if you have the unexposed surface flaked, the oil will stay on there, it'll traverse across the part, and you won't get galling. Common sense, right? Okay, now hand flaking has got a bit of a trick to it, but it's fairly simple. Just watch now. What I try to do is I tell the student to get the part at you're square to the part at your diagonal lines. Now I like to rest the handle up here in my shoulder. I bend over so I'm a little bit uncomfortable bending forward. I tip the blade up on a slight angle, and then I strike it with my hand. A lot of guys will start this and they'll strike down on it, and they'll darn near break their hand. But the secret to this is to pretend like you're going around in a circle, hit it on the upswing on the back side of your hand. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to be leaning straight backwards. And I move my feet over a little bit, basically. And then every time I hit it. And they interconnect with one another, and we'll show that a little later when we have some close-ups. And then after we went all the way across the whole part, we would come back Now, there's a little secret to this. I'm just going to take a scraper and just go like this. Let's give you some ideas as why half mooning is a lot better than straight cuts. Think about it. Now, if we had a drop of oil drop down into this part, and as the table traversed back and forth, it would take a longer time for that oil to loop around in here than it would be if it was a drop of oil and this traversed back and forth, it would just run right out. So the oil basically stays in the part longer. The flake mark here is a little bit higher and it's deeper in the center. So the oil, it takes a long time for it to run out. That's what half mooning is all about. I'd like to thank you. In this segment, we're going to talk about the Biax Power Scraper. But before I get into that, I want to discuss some of the blades. Now, this is what we call our finished blade kit. Now, these blades are real long and flexible. I'd say they're more forgiving than some of our other blades that are designed for more of an expert scraper. This is our all-purpose kit, where we have inserts with carbide tips that'll bolt into the insert. They're short, They're a little stouter. They take a lot of material off. You have a really lot of material to take off. You want to use this. But for you beginners out there, I'd recommend that you start it out with this. One of the parts inside this kit is what we call as our gauge, our radius gauge. Now when we're sharpening blades, and we'll get into sharpening a little later, we check our radius of our blade against this gauge. When we're rough scraping, we have a flat blade. When we're finished scraping, we have a round blade. This goes from a 140 to a 60 radius. Now later on when we get into in our advanced series, I'll show you how to sharpen to a 40 series, or 40 radius, and we use that for 40 points per inch. Now for you beginners, when you use one of these blades, don't start out with the 140 radius. Grind it to a 90 radius. Because what it amounts to is when you have a rounder blade on your part, you're less likely to get a corner scratch. Because when you have something real flat, it doesn't take much of an accident to get the corner to gouge. So you start it out with a round blade, you have less chance of scratching. Now the scraper, this is our all-purpose scraper. There's a heavier model and a lighter model. I prefer this model over everything. First of all, we have a little clamp on the bottom, a little piece of rubber. We're going to load the blade in there, snap it in. We want to make sure that the key goes into the keyway. We tighten this up so that it's snug, not super tight. If they wanted you to tighten that up as tight as you could get it, they'd never put this little rubber washer in here. So just tighten that up, get it snug. The strap. You want to make sure the strap is loose but still snug. Get it too tight, you cut the circulation off. Another thing you want to make sure is when you hold the scraper that the bottom of this is somewhat level. If you have it up too high, it'll jump back at you. You don't want to do that. You get it down too low, it won't dig in. So you want to have it about right, and you'll be able to feel it cutting real nice. Another thing that I'd like to recommend, that when you start to learn how to scrape, whether you're hand scraping or power scrape, get a piece of cast iron. This is 1 foot long, 3 inches wide, and it's about 1 inch thick. Start with something this small. Don't start out with a huge cast iron plate. It takes you an hour to scrape and 2 minutes to rub. You start with something like this. I can scrape across this in 2 or 3 minutes. And you'll learn a lot faster. And don't go ahead and grab the compound off your precision lathe and start to scrape on that. It's real obvious. If you make a mistake, you're in big trouble. Okay. Now, when we're scraping, we have different techniques of scraping. When we rough, remember we use a flat blade when we're an expert. After you get good at this, you can go to that flatter blade. But right now, use that 90 radius. This scraper has an adjustable stroke inside here. There's an Allen cap screw that we find at the top of the stroke, when this is at the very top of the stroke. I'll just unwind it so it's at the bottom. There's a quick way. We have a little adapter in there. You can go like that, push down, and you should look in there, and there's an Allen cap screw in there. When we're going to be roughing, we turn it all the way out, and then I tell people to turn it back a half a turn. That's at 3/4 of an inch stroke. Our machine has a rheostat on it. Now, the experts can scrape when you're roughing from 3 to 6. I'd say for you beginners, scrape at about 4 to 5. We put it on 5 right now. And what we're going to do, we first start out when we're roughing, when we're learning how. The beginners, when you learn how, do a circular motion across your part. Another thing that's real important, if you watch and see how while we're shooting this, keep an eye on my arms and my elbows. I try to keep everything close to my body. Now, it's real obvious if you sat and thought about it. If I had this out here, it'd get heavy after a while. So I keep it in close, have this straight, hold it like this, and I try to use my body. Remember when we were hand scraping and I talked about you push it with your body? So if we're power scraping, we want to use our body a lot and not use our arms. Now just look at this now. If a lot of guys, when they grab these things, they make some big mistakes because they'll start out going like this. And what happens then, scratch, scratch. But if you go like this, you always have that scraper at the same angle all the time. You're less likely to get a scratch. Now even the old pro here gets a scratch once in a while. I don't expect everybody to be perfect, but you don't want to get scratches. So we'll start out doing our circles. I'm going at approximately about the size of a quarter. Going around and getting everything. And I'll just continue on. And as you get more comfortable with what you're doing, you can speed this up. Now what I'm doing, I see how I turned around. This last corner, I'm not going to come over here and try to get this, because the blade will come back and it'll hit that and it'll break the blade, or you might break the machine. Another thing to remember with these scrapers, when you get close to an edge, you don't bring it out over halfway, otherwise it'll roll off and you'll make the edge round. Okay, so that's the circular technique. You get a lot of metal off. It's when your machine is out of weight, like say 5 thousandths. You can't get it machined. Anything over 5 thousandths, I generally tell people to get it machined if you can. So if it's under 5 thousandths or 5 thousandths, you can use the circular method to get it close. After you become confident in what you're doing, there's the next technique that you can use. Remember, I'm just deburring the part. Put a little highlighter on there so we can see what we're doing. Okay. Next step is what I call Z's or X's. Because basically what I do now is I make my diagonal lines across the part. Remember we were hand scraping? We did the diagonal lines across the part. Now we're going to do the diagonal lines across the part. But we're going to go up and then come up about a 5-degree angle and come back and forth and back and forth. And what happens is you get a scrape mark going that way and you get a scrape mark going this way. You get an X shape. Okay. File it this time. So, like I say, you got to, and this is real critical when you're doing this, to use your body. If you make a mistake with this, you're in big trouble. A lot of guys can't do this. If you can't do this in an average amount of time, I'd say if you can't pick this up within an hour or so of practice, don't use it until you get better qualified and feel comfortable holding the scraper, because you don't want to continually ruin your part. Our next step that we use, and as we're scraping, we use the circles method to get it close. I'd say within 3 thousandths. We use the Z's to get it down within a couple thousandths. And after that, we use what we call our crosses. Now, there's a technique for roughing Now, I would only recommend this for you experts, not the beginners. It's called heavy crosses. Heavy crosses is a long stroke with a real slow speed. Now, if you noticed a little earlier when I was scraping, I pressed this down. I pressed down hard enough that the blade bent down. Now, when we're doing heavy crosses, we're going to bend this blade a lot. But we're going to slow it down to approximately 3 on this rheostat. And we're going to lay this on. And we're going to just really take off some metal. See that a little bit. Now I can get a lot of metal off and not get a lot of chatter. Now I wouldn't recommend this, like I said, for the beginners right away because, like I said, if you get the corner caught, you're going to ruin your part. The experts can do this right now. Okay. You know, and then as we scrape, the more points we get, the shorter the stroke we go, the rounder the blade. So right now, I'm going to shorten up my stroke. Go at the top of the stroke. And we'll start to scrape this for some bearing. As before, when we were hand scraping, I've got another part that I've gotten down fairly close. So we'll go to that now. I scrape this down to where it's approximately got about 5 points per inch on it, per square inch. Now, there is another technique that we can use here. If we don't have this surface plate like we had earlier, what we can do, wipe off another part of the table. And I'm a big believer in using your hand. Like I said, you can feel the dirt. We'll spread the ink out over here. This ink, you got to get used to it. If you've been using some of the other tube type glues for a while, the type that it's hard to get off your hands, it'll take a while to get used to this Kanode ink. I know when I first used it, I didn't like it. But as I started to get used to it and I found out my hands were going to be clean at night, I learned how to use it. It's wonderful stuff. Okay, now this time we rub it, and I've left it on purpose high on the ends. Remember we talked about earlier about the way it's got a swivel on the fulcrum points, 30% on the ends. Now, if we can look at this, we can see that it's real shiny dark colors on the ends. Identifying the heights of the blue is real important when we're scraping. When we have a real light blue, it's not very high. When we have a real dark blue, it's high. When it's shiny, it's the highest. So it hinged on the ends. I have some blue in the middle, but I'm not going to scrape that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wipe that out of there so I don't accidentally go in there and scrape, because I know it's not high. That's a false reading in the middle. So what I'm going to do is come back in here. I got to shorten up my stroke a little bit more and scrape. Now what I'm doing now is similar to heavy crosses, but I call this crosses. And what we do is we do diagonal lines across the part, and we try to make individual scrape marks similar to what we're doing when we're hand scraping. Now this basically, this is a scraper. It does all the hard work pushing forward. All you have to do is steer it to the side to make those scrapes. A lot of guys will grab these things and they'll make a big mistake and they'll try to push forward on it. When they do that, they make deep, big holes, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 thousandths deep. So you've got to go sideways. stone it just to get rid of the burrs, not to remove any of the high spot. Wipe it off all the way around. We don't want to get any dirt on our plate. Scratch that plate. Rub it. See, I'm not bearing down on it, I'm rubbing. A lot of guys too, when they rub, they say, well, this is the only way to rub. Or no, you got to go circles. Or other guys, figure eights. I say it doesn't matter, as long as you blew it up. The only time it would matter is if you had a long bed machine and you had a short straight edge. That's when you would not move it. But we'll get into that in our advanced tapes in rebuilding. I'll explain that to you further. See, it's still high on the ends. Change directions. I'm going to get mad at this thing. I was doing cross, and I'm going to do some Z's. I'm going to get mad, get this thing over with. A lot of guys will say, well, where'd you scrape? Why were you just scraping all over the place? Well, the way I look at it, we got high points, we got low points up here that we know are higher than this area in the middle. So we scrape this down until we get to that point. Otherwise, we could be over here and have a 40-point bearing on this side and this side and still have a low spot in the middle. Now, if you're like me, you like to get your job done fast, you have other times to do things. There, it moved in. See, guys? It moved in. I haven't got much of a bearing, but it moved in. But this is a patient thing. You've got to be patient. Now, if you see what I'm doing here, I'm doing the crosses, but I'm picking it up. I go about an inch or half inch, depending upon how many blue spots are in one area. Pick it up. I'm trying to avoid these big, high, deep areas or low areas. Like I said, the majority of the machine tools out there, whether or not they have turkite on them, they have brass gibs, bronze gibs, or they're just cast on cast, you can get down to approximately 20 points per inch, and it's plenty good. Now this time we'll put a little highlighter on there. And what it does, especially when you're working in some areas where there's some real shiny fluorescent lights, this really takes away the glare. And a lot of guys prefer the orange ink. We have the ink in different colors: white, orange, red. You can get black or blue. I like the yellow, but I used orange for years. Rub it again. Hinge it. It's getting better, a lot better. And we got pretty good contact there. Right now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how to power flake. Power flaker, small unit. These blades, they're a lot different than a power scraper blade. They're carbide tipped. They load up the same way. They don't have a clamp though. You just stick them in, tighten those up, and you get those snug. Now the case is the same case, but it's different innards, or inside's a lot different. What we do, there's no adjustment of the stroke or anything. This one here, if you can see it, it rocks. And while we push forward on it, it rocks and makes the flake mark. It's basically the same thing. Push diagonal lines. And what we want to do is we push forward, come back, move our feet over, push forward, move our feet over. So we get that continuous same line. A lot of guys will start this thing out and they'll start using their arms. They can't get anything straight. They forget to move their feet and they'll have some great lines here. By the time they get down here, the thing's straight. So what we want to do though is forward, come back, forward. Just like before. Now remember, this is our series, this is our basic series. We have an advanced series of classes and tapes available. You can contact us for further information. Welcome back to our series on hand and power scraping. In our previous tapes we discussed the blades and the different types of blades we use for roughing and for finishing. And remember I described that we're going to have to learn how to sharpen the blades and use our radius gauge. So right now, before we get into the advanced scraping to 40 points, I'm going to show you how to sharpen these blades. So now let's go over to the grinder. All right, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set this at a -5 degrees. Remember, for cast iron, we use a -5 degrees. Okay, remember now, we have our gauge. And now that we're going to be scraping to the 40 points, we need to sharpen our blades to at least the 60 radius. And here's what we do. We just a shot of coolant, come across, once that side, turn it over, give it the other side. Check our radius, that's fine. We also check our blade, make sure there's no nicks in it. I take my thumbnail and I just rub it along here, similar to what a fisherman would do with a fish hook. Make sure it's sharp. It is, it's real sharp. Remember, for finishing work we use 60 radius or a 40 radius. We'd also take the smaller blade and do the same thing to it. Want to work the whole face of the wheel so we don't end up with a groove in it. This is a 600 grit diamond wheel I'm using right now. I would just keep checking. See, now that's real good. We also have a 1200 grit diamond wheel that we could, if we wanted to get a real lap finish on here, we could install it in minutes or seconds. Okay, now we'll go back over to the table and scrape again. Now we're back. Now if you do buy a 380BL scraper from DAPRA, this is the way it'll come. If you noticed, I have a customized model. I like to put the pad on the end because what I tell people, it takes away the hurt. Because like I said, I like to use my body. And if you push with your body with this type of scraper, it could start to hurt. I want to show you just a little bit about how to hold this hand scraper. I hold the top part similar to what you would with a golf club. And then you'd come over and put this hand on top and grip it. You don't go like this or like this, because what will happen if you go along, you hit your hand on the part, you could hurt yourself pretty bad. So just go like this. You keep it level, up a little bit and back, and you got to bend it down, similar to what we did when we were power scraping. Bend it and push it. Another technique that some people do, there's tall people, short people. Some people will put it up here on their shoulder, and other people that have a part down lower can put it on their hip. But in this particular place, we'll put it right on the body and push it with the body. So here we'll start to scrape this part now. Try to get 40 points on it. Remember I said there's different techniques. Now I'm going to come out, go in and come out. I'm going to avoid the big holes, get the blue. Trying to make my cut as long as it is wide. That's a real tip to remember to do. Try to get that square checkerboard look. Now if I'm going after a high spot and I can't seem to hit it, I don't want to keep digging around it. Otherwise I'll dig the hole deeper that's around it. So I just move on, and after a while I come back and get it. Try to keep your eyes right in the center of the blade. And when I dive in with the blade, when I hit the metal, I push down a little bit. I want to have the chip come off right at the center of the blade. Now what will happen, as the blade gets dull, you might have to rock it a little bit. So when that starts happening, go sharpen your blade or flip it over to the other side that you know is already sharp. Now there is another technique that more of you advanced students might want to try. It's like when we're sitting here on a high spot, you might want to get it over on the left side of the blade and roll the blade just a slight amount and get the other blue spot. Well, that'll save you some time, but I only want my advanced students to do that because you might roll too far and get a scratch. Now it sounds like we're taking off a lot of material, but I'm actually only taking off a couple tenths. Now see how I got my hands, remember? Like this, golf club, on top. I want to push. I'm going to stay out of that hole right there. I'm not going to go in there. It's amazing. A lot of people think you have to scrape every high spot. But the ones, those real small little faint ones there that I've missed, when I come back through and I stone it, they'll be cut down lower. I try to make the individual mark so I have an individual cut. Otherwise, if I have them all touching one another, I'll dig one big, deep, long valley, I call it, or a hole. Now remember what we talked about earlier. We always scrape diagonal lines across the part. Now if you've been watching me now, you can see I've been walking forward and basically and backward as I scrape. I move my feet and I always keep my hands and the angle at the same degree. And I start on this side, and I try to make a straight line across the part, and I scrape the blue spots that are within that path. And that really starts to develop the checkerboard pattern. I've even had people call it the chessboard pattern. Like I said in the first tape, people can get in real trouble when they do this, where they will be over here a little bit and over here a little bit, and they're never consistent. If they do that, they can never get their checkerboard look. Now, I just wanted to show you one more of that technique of bump scraping. Bump scraping is fairly simple. I've had a lot of people that could really do this well, and it is a good way. You set your scraper on the part, have your hand on the end of the scraper, and basically hit the end of the scraper with the palm of your hand. It's a little bit more time consuming. In some ways, though, it is a little bit more relaxing. It isn't so hard on your arms and your body. And I've seen people use this method. They can scrape as fast as I can the other method. Now we're going to clean up the part and blue it up, and we'll see what we have. And what we can do too, put a little of our highlighter on now, it'll take away the glare. Remember, like I said in the other tape, this is real handy when you have a shop that has the real bad lighting where you have lots of glare. Blue up our plate, rub it. This is getting real sticky now too. There's a lot of vacuum. And I rub it a long time because I want to really see the different colors of my blue. And I'll show you that in just a minute. We can circle it, figures eight, whatever you like. But we always hinge it. Here it popped. Now, there's the bearing. Now, the technique that I told you about earlier, identifying different types of blue, what we're going to do right now is we're going to lay the part on the plate where there's no blue. And we're going to rub again. And what we're going to do is we're going to transfer the blue off of the part onto the plate, basically. And we're going to really shine and polish up the very, very highest points. And when we do that, we can see where the very, very highest points are, and we can start to scrape those. Those are approximately a tenth higher than the other points. So what we'll eventually do after we scrape all these shiny ones off, we'll have shiny all over, and we'll have a great bearing. I've drawn up 5 different classes of blue. I say a class 1, there's no blue. It's not touching. It's real obvious, but we just want to give that a class. So if it's not touching, we don't scrape there. Number 2, you have a real glob, thick blue, greasy look. That's a smear. We wipe that off and re-blue our part, because we don't want to scrape where there's smear because it's false reading. We could hurt ourselves. Number 3, it's a light blue or the same color as the ink that we're using. Now, what I call that's the lowest of our high spots. Number 4, our blue is black, or it's a dark blue. That's the second highest of our high spots. And number 5, that is shiny like a mirror. And that's the highest of our high spots. What happens there, that's so high that the blue is actually polished off of that particular piece. You really need to concentrate on our practice now to make sure that you can identify the high points, the second highest points, and the lowest points. You know, another thing I referred to in the video, the first video, about scraping through the high spots to get down to the lower points. But let's say we measured our part with a feeler gauge and we could get a 2/1000 feeler gauge into a certain area where there's a hole. A lot of guys, what they'll do is they'll come over and they'll scrape this high spot, this high spot, this high spot, and this high spot, and they'll end up, like I said earlier, with a heck of a good bearing. A 40-point bearing over here and a big hole right here. What I tell people to do is get angry and get mad and go through here and cut through these holes and these high spots, get the material off fast to get down to the lowest point, because it saves you a lot of time. Now if you look at the blue, you can see how it's real black over here. I'm going to scrape that black blue and that shinier blue. Leave the lighter blue alone this time. There's a hole there right in the middle. I'm going to stay out of that. Jump over it, come over to this side. Occasionally you might have to blow off the chips. The same thing goes here now. Got some nice shiny black ones. We're going to scrape those, and we're not going to come over into here where there's a smear. We'll leave that alone. I missed a couple there, so I'm going to come back and get them because I didn't want to dig a hole around them. See, I avoided that big hole there, guys? Now that we're nearing the end of the part, this kind of reminds me, I said it was fun, reminds me of a story of a friend of mine who's in the business, rebuilding business, and he told me it might be fun, but we run a business, it's not a hobby. And I've proven in my seminars that we've done at General Motors that using the power scraper I can achieve as the same amount of bearing points per inch and faster, and I guarantee I can improve productivity by 50%. And it's a fact. The power scraper is a lot handier, a lot easier. You get a lot more consistent. It's not such a hard job. Your bones don't ache and your body doesn't ache. But like I said, you still need to learn how to do this. Now I'm going to demonstrate the power scraper and the technique 40 points per square inch. Now we have to take out our flatter blade that we were using before and put in our rounder blade that we ground earlier in the tape. And we just get this snug. I'm going to shorten up our stroke. And remember we did the crosses earlier. What I'm going to try to do here now, I'm going to demonstrate to you what we call dive bombing. It's Technique 40. I had a student that nicknamed it dive bombing. I used to call it point spotting. And point spotting is you have to hold the scraper a little bit differently now. We want to suck the scraper up in close to our body and be able to get our eyes right over the top of the blade so we can really get a good visual and go in and individually scrape each point, similar to what we did when we were hand scraping. Remember, we scraped individual points. We're going to still stay on the same angle the entire time. So here we go. Now do you see how I'm holding the scraper? I'm pinching it down here on the bottom. And I'm putting my hand in here and I'm getting my hands up real close to each other. I have a lot better control than if I was out here like this. I couldn't see what I was doing now. I need to see what I'm doing. If I want to get those precision points, I need to see what I'm doing. We've got the machine running. Now you can see the advantage of the power scraper over the hand scraper. I feel a lot better. I got a consistent stroke. The stroke length is the exact same stroke length every time. And we can get the same straight line all the way across. We can generate that checkerboard effect real fast. Now we need to put that highlighter on. It's very important. Takes away the glare. There's a lot of glare when you're scraping these types of points. This takes a lot of concentration too. You need to think about hitting that spot. Like I said when we were hand scraping, we can't afford to dig a hole around it, especially with a power scraper. Wipe it off. This time we'll blue the part, the plate, wipe it. Real sticky again. Hinges, a little high in the middle, but not too bad. I'll come back over. Now I'm going to put a narrower blade in. I'm also going to shorten my stroke. Remember, when you're roughing, you have a long stroke, and when you're finishing, you have a medium stroke, and when you're point spotting, you have a real short stroke. You make more points in that per square inch. hard work and patience, here's the finished part. Well, that'll bring us to a conclusion on this series of tapes. I hope you've got some new insight on hand and power scraping. If you'd like some more information on our tools, our equipment, contact your local DAPRA distributor. And I am also available for in-house training seminars if you need it. I'd like to thank you